It's time for the World Cup.
How can so many countries, languages, and cultures
And while I always get excited about the tournament, this year things are a bit weird. We're seeing matches played in December, not summer. Of course, that's because the host happens to be Qatar, which is simply way too hot to have games played in the summer. Beyond having an inhospitable climate, Qatar doesn't have a rich football history. Its interest is more recently driven by wealth and global power originating from oil. So when Qatar says they plan to make this World Cup carbon neutral, it unsurprisingly raises a few eyebrows. In this video, we get into that claim, and why the World Cup is even here, in the desert,
Qatar.
in the first place.
Alright, I'm at this bar right now. This is totally packed. We're here to watch USA versus Wales. I don't even know why I'm bothering to talk here because it's packed. We're probably not going to hear a thing. I'm having a blast though.
So I've always been a little bit romantic about the World Cup. I just have incredible memories associated with the tournament. Like, I remember waking up at 6 a.m. with a friend in Seoul to go out into the middle of a town square to watch Korea versus Russia in 2014. I remember later that summer being in Taiwan when Argentina and Germany faced each other in the final. I was staying in a hostel, and at 2 a.m. Taipei time, everybody got up, walked together to the town square, and I was partying with people from Scotland and Singapore. Unfortunately, though, international football is a bit complicated. The beautiful game has an ugly side. There are disgusting displays of racism. There's the pay discrepancies between men and women's teams. Big oil has its hand all over the sport. And this year, as hosting duties fall on oil-rich Qatar, there are a whole host of environmental questions. So I've been seeing a lot of videos, podcasts, and articles all about how Qatar basically bought and bribed its way into hosting the 2022 World Cup.
But here's where it's shady.
I've also seen a lot of stuff about the many human rights concerns.
Migrant workers, stadium,
anti-gay,
everything.
But I want to focus on one particular aspect, the environment. You see, Qatar has put out a declaration that just about anyone should have a hard time believing.
a fully carbon-neutral World Cup.
Pledges to go carbon neutral are becoming more and more common. You're seeing big corporations and governments make this sort of claim. And this isn't even the first time we've heard it from a World Cup host. Back in 2006, Germany made the same commitment. But this is especially hard to believe coming from Qatar. Qatar is basically the wealthiest country on earth, with its wealth coming almost entirely from oil. Per capita, there's only one other country that emits more than Qatar. So when Qatar says they're going to be carbon neutral with the 2022 World Cup, yeah, I smell greenwashing all over that. So when a company or even a government goes carbon neutral, it's trying to balance out its emissions by spending money on projects that remove carbon. One of the most straightforward examples would be tree planting. Trees absorb carbon, so there you go. But you might also see things like clean cook stoves in developing countries, or solar and wind energy products. It's really easy to understand the appeal around this. It makes a company look good and proactive about, it also helps remove any guilt a consumer might feel about using a particular product. The thing is, carbon offsetting is not as straightforward as it first seems. So for starters, you have to make sure you're not paying for a project that would have happened anyways, because that's not an offset. You have to make sure you're not double counting trees planted or clean cook stoves. You don't want to have the same thing funded by two groups. You also have to make sure that, let's say you're protecting a rainforest, you don't just have people cut down trees somewhere else. That's not offsetting anything, that's just moving the problem. It's great if you plant trees, because trees will one day sequester a ton of carbon, but they're going to take years to grow mature. And when it comes to bringing down our emissions, we don't have years and years to spare. All these things are legitimate critiques, and they're not even the biggest problem with going carbon neutral. The biggest problem is that it isn't enough. Climate Interactive is an org that does a lot of modeling of emissions, and they found that even if we deployed every possible natural offset, planted every tree possible, we'd still be on pace for catastrophic climate change. We can't buy our way out of emitting. It's not enough to just pay to offset our messes. We actually still need to cut down the emissions we're putting out. Alright, let's talk World Cup 2022. In theory, what would Qatar have to offset in order to be carbon neutral? The top 3 sources of emissions for the World Cup comes from the construction of stadiums, the construction of new infrastructure and accommodations for all the visitors, and of course the international air travel to get them all there. According to Qatar, this World Cup is producing 3.6 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. That's a lot. This number has apparently been verified by South Pole, which is a widely respected carbon monitoring group. That said, it appears to be a big undercount. The watchdog group Carbon Market Watch has estimated the actual emissions to be closer to 6 million. So why such a discrepancy? One big reason are those stadiums. Qatar is saying that these stadiums are going to be used for many events in the years to come, so only a portion of their emissions for construction can really be attributed to the World Cup. I mean, it's possible, but history suggests otherwise. A lot of the stadiums we've seen built in South Africa, Brazil, and Russia in recent World Cups have since gone abandoned. And we haven't even started to dive into Qatar's legacy as an oil-rich state. Let's go to Qatar.
So I always kind of knew Qatar's airport was basically a flex, but check this out. You can get an official World Cup ball for just $172. They've got, well, a full-on jungle. The parts that aren't a jungle are basically like a shopping mall. Everything in here is like, you know, a luxury brand retail store. Honestly, I always figured it would just be a matter of time before I wound up here because, you know, I love to travel, so I always have these alerts set up for good deals on flights, and I get to see where all these routes are going. A few years ago, I started to notice more and more routes were going through Doha, Qatar. But the more I saw it as a frequent connection, the more it started to feel inevitable, like someday I'd be here. So this is actually a pretty long layover, 10 hours. The unfortunate thing is those 10 hours are from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., so I can't exactly get out of the airport and go see the city because everything's closed. There's just not much to see right now. It turns out really long layovers in Qatar are not that uncommon, and this is a bit by design. If you book with Qatar Airways, you can reserve like 5-hour increment packages for longer layovers where you can leave the airport and just be guided go see something interesting in the city. I think there's like a Islamic art museum and a central souk that are really popular. This connection between business and tourism, Qatar Airways, and Qatar's extreme wealth from oil is no coincidence. It's all connected. Let me explain that. So back in the day, Qatar was pretty much inhabited by nomadic groups and fishing villages. Really humble beginnings, and that makes it astounding when you think in a matter of decades they became one of the wealthiest nations throughout all of history. So after World War I, Qatar began their relationship with Great Britain as a protectorate. They benefited from having the military support, and in turn Britain benefited from the oil that was available, at least until Qatari independence in 1971. Shortly after that, Qatar discovers they are sitting on way more oil than anybody realized. Look at that. What happens from there is pretty straightforward. All this oil belongs to Qatar. It's a small nation, only like 200,000-300,000 people, so it doesn't take much for everybody to benefit from this surplus. Now, Qatar does not have the workforce to put all this stuff up quickly, so they begin importing workers from places like Bangladesh or the Philippines, Nepal. Now, I need to highlight that the way they do this is through the system called kafala, which basically puts the well-being, the safety, and the coordination of these foreign workers all in the hands of their employer or their sponsor. In cases where that sponsor is abusive or negligent of their human rights, they have very little protection, and this happens a lot. You can see in maps places where foreign workers are not allowed to enter that are reserved for Qatari citizens. Many workers, especially this past summer with the World Cup, were forced to work in really inhumane conditions in hot desert heat. Many of them have their passports taken. Many of them are charged money to come to Qatar and work, meaning they start out in debt and many times don't ever leave debt.
So with all that context in mind, why did Qatar lobby so hard to get the World Cup? We know that fossil fuels aren't sustainable. They're not sustainable for the planet, and so they won't be sustainable for business either. In fact, in the US and many other places, we're already seeing fossil fuel demand and consumption in decline. Qatar knows this too. In fact, I could tell you how all the fossil fuel companies have known this since the 1970s and have been misleading the public ever since, but that's another video. What do you do if you're a tiny, loaded nation that's been having a good time because of oil and you don't want to go back?
You need to diversify your bonds.
You got to convert them into something else. In 2005, Qatar's emir funded the Qatari Investment Authority to minimize the risk from reliance on oil. The QIA has been using the state's wealth to buy big assets that can continue to benefit Qatar, even if the oil money were to suddenly dry up. Over the past 2 decades, the most ridiculous global-level shopping spree has been taking place right under our noses.
Get in, loser, we're going shopping.
Some of the stuff Qatar bought might surprise you. It's time for a Qatar haul. Let's see what they got. They bought the Empire State Building for £557 million. They bought £5.9 billion in shares of Volkswagen. And they bought 2 of the UK's largest retail stores, Harrods and Sainsbury's. For £576 million, they bought the Italian fashion line Valentino. They bought the 2 most expensive paintings in the world. It's these 2 right here. They also carved out a big space in air transportation. Qatar Airways now holds Aer Lingus, Iberia, Vueling, and a large share of British Airways. It's made the Doha airport a major hub and turned Qatar into a business destination. Oh, and get this, they've been spending a lot of money on football too. For £85 million, they bought the French football team Paris Saint-Germain, and their value has undoubtedly gone up since because Qatar's turned them into a brand, a fashion icon, and they signed Messi. Qatar is now a major financial player, and something like the World Cup builds its soft power, its international recognition, and its ability to influence the world at large. Okay, so Qatar is wealthy because of oil. That's straightforward enough, but they know that's not going to last forever. Oil is already on its way out. So what is Qatar doing? They're trying to spread their brand and ownership across a number of different industries. They would also love to avoid going down with the ship, as PR around oil has never been worse. And hosting a World Cup and making it carbon neutral seems like a really good way to try and do that. Qatar's already been doing a lot to try and boost their environmental image. One of the 8 stadiums it's built is made out of shipping containers so that it can be disassembled, recycled, or repurposed for things after the World Cup. I mean, reusing stuff is great. I feel like transporting hundreds of shipping containers around the country is still gonna rack up some emissions, but Qatar is also planning to plant some 16,000 trees around the country, which is pretty cool. Trees are a good thing most of the time, but this pales in comparison to the 200,000 spectators and all their flying emissions who are set to arrive in the country. The trees are gonna offset the emissions of 20 of them. Let's go back to Qatar's original plan of making the World Cup carbon neutral. They've got 3.6 million metric tons of carbon to address. Okay, well, you need to buy carbon credits from somewhere, and some agencies have emerged as some of the more reputable ones. Qatar is offsetting its World Cup emissions through an agency called the Global Carbon Council. And let's just say this is not one of the more established agencies. Now, the Global Carbon Council was established by the Gulf Organization for Research and Development, which is owned by the Qatari DR Real Estate Investment Company. You want to guess who owns that company? The Qatari Investment Authority. That's right, the big shopper spending loads of fossil fuel money over the past couple decades. So this offsetting agency is funded by fossil fuel money, and it's using its own rules rather than the well-established ones. So the offsetting agency is funded by fossil fuel money, and it's using its own rules rather than the many we have commonly established. At the start of the World Cup, only 3 projects have been funded so far with that World Cup money. It's 2 wind farms and a hydro plant in Turkey and Serbia. These are offsetting about 350,000 tons of carbon, so that's like less than 1/10 of the World Cup emissions. It's easy to look at Qatar's supposed attempt at a carbon-neutral World Cup as proof that carbon neutrality is a myth. And in a lot of ways, that's not wrong. It really is a flawed system. But then again, what's our alternative? Just putting out those emissions and not doing anything about it? Is an imperfect system better than no system? I can see that. But above all, I want to see a system that gets better. Seriously, I want more World Cups. Like, that was a blast right there. And I love that it's a global stage where kids in rural villages can see people with a similar story have their dreams come true. I love that it's a much healthier expression of national pride. There are incredible stories about peace building, national level reconciliation and unity coming out of seeing a country's team succeed. And yeah, there's lots of ugliness too, but I'm still not giving up on the beautiful game. I hope that in the future we can continue innovating and finding climate-friendlier ways of doing things. Like maybe we could build fewer stadiums and make better use of the ones that are already there. Maybe we can still contribute to climate-positive projects in a way that's not prone to all the missteps. And as long as a stage as big and as global as the World Cup is available, it can serve as a vital platform to get the word out on climate action and social change.